Wow, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you so much for giving my talk. In all honesty, it's amazing that even as the CEO of such a huge company with all of the different business areas, you still have accurate and specific knowledge about such a new field, such as DNA-based storage. So my company, Catalog, we're building a platform to store and compute digital data using DNA. And the problem that we're trying to solve, as Stefan mentioned, is very obvious and immediate. One of them is the explosion of data creation. We're living inside of an explosion of data creation. By 2025, we're projected to generate about 175 zettabytes of data, of which about 40% will be useful for enterprise operations, but we'll only be able to store about 12.5% of it using traditional media. And also, the end of Moore's law means that a lot of that data will be pushed down to colder tiers of storage where it'll just sit on shelves collecting dust. And that's not adding value for the company, and we're hoping to change all of that using DNA as a medium, as both a storage medium and a computational medium. So I thought I'd start out with a brief history of DNA-based storage. As you can see, we've all been doing it for billions of years. We've had one upgrade from RNA to DNA, and it's been that for about 3.5 billion years. It's been perfected over billions of years of evolution as an ideal storage medium, as well as a computational medium. And the thought of using it for data storage has been around for decades. So even before the discovery of the structure of DNA, Erwin Schrödinger postulated that, or he argued that life could be thought of in terms of data storage and passing on data to your offspring. And to understand life then would mean to crack the code of hereditary code and to discover those molecules and to understand how it encodes that information. And by 1952, of course, the seminal X-ray crystallography work by Rosalind Franklin led to the discovery of its structure. Now, when I say DNA, this is what we all think about. It's the material inside of the chromosomes that can be found in the nucleus of our cells. But that's not the only source of DNA. The same material can be built up from the ground up using chemical processes. And that's what we use at Catalog, synthetic DNA, not DNA that we purify from our interns. And we keep it inside of tubes, and we don't put it back into cells. So the first person to ever think of the idea of using DNA for digital data storage was this person back in the 60s, a Russian physicist that Mikhail Niemann, that postulated that we could be using this material for storage, retrieval, and recording of the information. And the first person to actually do it was back in the 80s. Joe Davis, who was an artist that worked with the Harvard Medical School scientists to put in a bacterial cell now this very small message that he encoded into DNA. After that, the interest kind of died down. There's been no significant work until very recently. And we think one of the reasons behind the resurgence of interest in this technology is coming from the massive decrease, the massive enhancement in the sequencing technology of DNA. That, of course, was driven largely by the Human Genome Project. And you see Moore's law up there, which is by itself an exponential curve, but the cost of sequencing the material has been going down even faster than that. So because of this, back in 2012, 2 back-to-back papers came out, one from the EBI and another from Harvard Medical School, that encoded previously unprecedented amounts of information, 5 megabytes of data. And then further progress was made. Back in 2016, Microsoft published their work where they put in 200 megabytes of data and setting the world record for back then. But MIT Tech Review independently thought that this work would have cost the researchers about $800,000 worth of DNA synthesis. So this was clearly still far away from becoming a viable solution economically as a data storage medium. Now, what are some of the reasons why we're so interested in DNA? Stefan mentioned a lot of them. One is the information density. We can store about 200 petabytes per gram of DNA. The stability of the molecules is extreme. Once you put the data into DNA, whether it's synthetic or biological, it'll last for thousands of years. You can also use very simple molecular biology tools that's been developed over the last few decades to copy the information to thousands of different copies. Right now, if you have very important data, you would keep it in 2 or 3 different locations. But imagine what could be possible if we could just, for free, make 100,000 copies of our important data in a very small vial. And of course, DNA will always be readable, because our genetic information will be stored in DNA. We can make the assumption that we'll always retain the technology to read back DNA sequences. And the last part is something that we as a company are extremely excited about. It's the ability to store, but also compute data while it's still in DNA form. And that's done by using enzymes and other DNA molecules to touch all of the bits, whether it's a megabyte or an exabyte, simultaneously, for an extremely parallel, low-power computing. We think this is something that can solve a lot of the challenges that will come with the explosion of data and the end of Moore's law. Now, with traditional computing, if you plot the data size that you're computing on and any kind of resource, whether it's time or energy, on the other axis, you'll see a proportional increase in the resources that it takes with the growth of data size. And with improvements in technology, that curve will simply shift to the left, making it still a linear curve. But with DNA-based computing, because you're adding in coprocessors as you store the data, the resources that it takes to compute on larger and larger data doesn't increase with the increase of data size. Now, I mentioned before that other people have been trying this technology for decades, and back in 2016, Microsoft published their work for 200 megabytes. It was still way too expensive to store a lot of data in DNA. And that's where we, a group at MIT, got the idea of starting a company. We had an idea not of writing each base pair one by one, like copying down a book with a pen and paper, but creating typefaces, equivalent of typefaces in DNA, and using an inkjet printer to combine them in different combinations so that we can create a lot of entropy in a very short period of time. And how we encode information with that entropy isn't something I'm going to talk about on this stage, but I'm happy to answer questions offline throughout the conference. And so this is a short video that shows you how our machine that we've recently built and will be using this year to do pilot projects with large entertainment companies and oil and gas companies, how it works. Play the video, please.
The system is basically a printer, but instead of an ink, it uses DNA.
The machine really starts with this plastic webbing. And so the webbing starts to unwind. And the first place it goes is a module that we call the print engine. And a series of print heads dispense small droplets of liquid that contain the DNA. And you have multiple DNA components or parts being added to one spot, one little droplet on this plastic sheet.
So each dot on the webbing corresponds to a specific set of bytes in your original data.
So those dots, we're creating 600,000 of them every second.
And then we add a reaction mixture that contains the enzyme that hooks all of the DNA parts together.
And so then the plastic sheet moves into this large chamber. It's like they go into the sun, they get heated up, and then they go into this cold bath. And that's the place where all of the DNA that you have just stitched together drops off the plastic and can be collected in this large pool of liquid. That becomes our DNA library.
The 10th of Wikipedia.
And then we'll take this solution, clean it up.
So we get it down to under a milliliter.
It will contain all the information.
And now that we're able to store a terabit in DNA, this opens up a lot of possibilities of what can then be done in terms of computing.
With DNA computing, You could take your entire data center, put it into one pellet, take hundreds of such pellets, and operate on all of them in parallel.
Thank you. Thank you, and I brought it with me, the Wikipedia that we encoded. I've been carrying it around for months in my pocket, and I think it's still active. So happy to show it to you after the talk. So I'll leave you with some final thoughts. We think that DNA-based storage and our technology isn't just limited to archival data or even large computation. We think that by making this possible, by being able to put a lot of data into a very small volume for a really long time, making that possible, there could be entirely new applications that's kind of even hard to think about right now. One of them could be, what if we were to store all of our health information inside of a capsule in DNA form on our bodies and we carry it around? That way we can have it always accessible to you because hospitals will have sequencers, but it'll be totally offline, away from prying eyes and hackers. It'll be quantum resilient, so to speak. And I mentioned in the beginning that it'll be extremely easy to make many, many copies of the information in a very small volume. If blockchain technologies were to become mainstream and we decided to back up all of our ledgers for distributed storage across thousands of different locations in the world, DNA is something that would be ideal for that. And finally, many entrepreneurs talk a lot about setting up civilization in other planets, including Mars. If we were to actually send people to Mars, wouldn't we want to send them off with the accumulated knowledge of the human race? We could never send an entire data center across such a distance, but we could send just a shoebox full of DNA. Thank you.
Wasn't this amazing? This was really amazing. I think it was a glimpse in our future. What does it mean for a publisher, Hubert, to store information? What does it mean for all our patients, for the patients, for every one of us? In this little glass. Now, I have the pleasure and the personal joy to call on stage my new friend, Jodi Halpern, professor of bioethics at the University of California and co-founder of the Berkeley Group on the ethics and regulation of innovative technology. Jodi, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's already been a long morning, so anybody who wants to stand up for a moment and stretch. Want to take 1 second? Feel free to stand up. Move your neck around. I'm an ethics teacher, and I teach doctoral students in science and technology fields how to think through ethics problems for themselves. So I'm going to make this a little bit interactive, I hope. And I just want to call out Stefan's comments because they were really compelling to me, and he brought out some very important features of the ethics of innovative technologies that we've been hearing about, issues such as manipulation and justice, which I'll cover. But what I really want to point out is I'm with him that we are, I would say everybody at this conference is here because in some way we believe that technology is very important to move forward on, to do good and to improve human health and well-being. And yet we see this huge public backlash. And so the question is, what are we missing? What's our blind spot as experts? And I'm going to say that we're all experts. Everyone in this room is an expert, because I'm defining expert or leader as someone who believes that they have something to offer through innovation or change, where they believe they have the point of view of changing society. And so all of us at DLD fit that. And my big news for you is that experts, all of us, do not have the same ethical system as the general public. That's what I really want to talk to you about today. So we had a great, somebody quoted the other day a very famous quote: technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. I love that quote. But I think that ethics itself, ethical systems and paradigms, they actually are not neutral either. Whose ethical paradigm is going to dominate how we approach technology? Or are we going to really listen to the public and make sure that as experts that we're not in our own bubble of ethics? So I'm not really going to talk to you about the technology today, but about the ethical bubble that we're in, that I don't think most people are aware of. Basically, experts believe, and this is empirically proven, that in an ethics of social engineering, we believe that we can do things that in the long view or from a bird's eye view can maximize benefits and minimize harms through our interventions. And this should be familiar to you as the ethics of utilitarianism. And it's not trashing utilitarianism to summarize it with the very well-known phrase that the ends justifies the means. That's actually what the founders of utilitarianism meant by creating that ethical framework. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century were basically the early social engineers. They were the disruptors of their day. They were humanitarians and to some degree utopians who saw horrible suffering in their cities. London in their time was highly polluted. There was just terrible public health. They also, utilitarianism and public health were founded by essentially the same people. There were people suffering in mental asylums, and they looked at all this societal suffering and said, you know, we've got to get rid of the typical way that people think about ethical obligations, which is that they have this duty to this person or that obligation to that person, and take all those interpersonal duties, which they saw as almost etiquette. We've got to wipe that out and bypass that and think about how, from a social engineering point of view, we can create the most ultimate good and alleviate the most harm. And so it was by design that utilitarianism bypassed the ethics of how one person treats the person in front of them. That was seen as an externality or a burden on utopian thinking. So to get rid of the shackles of the whole ethical tradition before utilitarianism, what was it that they were wiping away? Well, the whole tradition of ethics up until utilitarianism is a tradition of duties and rights. So you had duties based on your role. You had parental duties, you had duties to the king or the leader, teachers had duties to students, doctors had duties to patients, and it was all very ramified, complex, and interpersonal. And then since the Enlightenment, in addition to duties that people had to actual people in front of them, to individuals, there was this idea of rights, which is very familiar to all of us: rights to autonomy, rights to self-determination. And what a lot of people don't realize is that duties and rights are basically the same thing. If you have a right to autonomy, I have a duty to respect your autonomy. They're just the exact same thing, but the theory of all ethics other than utilitarianism that covers rights and duties is called deontology. Ology is the study of, deont means duties, but if it had been invented after the 19th century, it would have been called the theory of rights or human rights. So I hope I've explained that utilitarianism was invented to bypass human rights. That's the main, if you remember nothing else I say today, I need you to really get that. Because my team, we've reviewed, there's now over 80 AI ethics guidelines that were issued by governments, NGOs, and companies in the past 4 years. And we've reviewed them, and those guidelines don't show an understanding of this concept. So you'll see things in some of the top 5 companies, you'll see corporate ethics guidelines that say things like, we will respect human rights unless we can do more benefit and minimize more harms by not doing so. So that shows this idea that utilitarianism can swallow everything, which is not true by definition. So just to make it very graphic, there's 2 different axes of ethical decision making. On the one axis is benefits and harms, maximizing benefit and minimizing harms. And on the other axis is rights and duties. And they go like this, okay? So that's really interesting. So what are you supposed to do as leaders? Are you supposed to give up on utilitarianism? Oh, I guess I haven't told you the most important thing about this. Research shows, I said it early on, that experts are utilitarian and that the general public are deontologists. So if you think about what the public has complained about with tech, they've said things like, what about my privacy rights? What about my autonomy? What about treating people fairly and justice? Those are rights issues. But we're saying things like, we can create so much more social benefit, or we can get rid of these harms. Those are utilitarian claims. So the title of this panel or this session is disruption and distrust. But the distrust to me is because not about technology per se, but because we're not hearing what the public's ethical concerns are actually about. So to get you engaged in this and do some, I said I would give you some things to do. Let me first ask you to do an exercise that I asked my students to do on the first day of class, because I just want to get them to see that maximizing benefits and minimizing harms aren't the only thing we care about. So I want you each to imagine that you have the option of having a small thing planted in your brain that will, we would say AI now, although I've been doing this experiment for 21 years, so I don't know what I used to call it. But you have some kind of advanced AI device that once implanted in your brain will make all your decisions for you, especially your important and serious life decisions. What career, and my students are usually in their 20s, so I say what career to pursue, who to marry, where to live. But for us, it can be all that, plus whether to retire, whether to change careers, whether to move. All of those decisions will be made by this little device in your head in such a way that it will maximize your benefit and minimize your harm. You'll wind up with more happiness and less suffering. The thing is, you don't get to consult with it. You won't even be aware of it because you won't even think about decision making as a part of your life. You'll just smoothly go from one phase to the next. And all that self-reflection and knowing yourself and thinking about your values will just poof, go away. I want you to seriously take a minute now, and I'll be quiet, and think whether you would take the deal. Would you accept the device? Just want people to think about that for a minute. How many of you would accept the device? Wow. That's almost nobody raised their hands. So there goes utilitarianism as the only thing. In other words, what you're experiencing right now for yourself is the clash of 2 ethical systems. On the one hand, we all do want to have more benefit, more health, more well-being, and less suffering. But on the other hand, we're not so ready to give up little niggly things like our autonomy or our role in our own decision-making. So what does this mean? Well, what I want to put this into a context of health and bioengineering, because that's the context that I work the most in, and that's where Merck is making so much of a serious contribution. And just share that this same conflict between experts being utilitarians and ordinary people, which is what we were when we did that experiment. You were thinking as a person, not as an expert, by the way, is why you shifted. When we think about something really serious like terrible diseases, we get even more utilitarian as experts. We even more want to find ways of wiping those diseases out, and we become even less sensitive to individual procedural rights, like the right to autonomy. And to study this, I have just completed with my research group, we interviewed 40 leading gene editing scientists, and we really wanted to understand, we did hour-and-a-half interviews with each of them to really understand their ethical worldviews and their motivation and how they saw what they were doing. And what was really interesting is these were all scientists poised to do translation. So they might have been preclinical trial or trying to partnering with others to get what they were doing into a clinical trial. And there were people that were primarily financially motivated. They were starting companies and that was their main thing. But I would say overall, everyone, in addition to whatever financial motives, people really wanted to do good. They were aware of the blood or hematologic or oncologic or eye diseases. That's areas where gene editing is making a lot of progress. They were aware of those diseases and how much they really hurt people and how much suffering they caused. And they were really trying to create a product that would make people's lives much, much better. And so they were good utilitarians and they had all the right motives. But when we talked to them about, they were all involved in thinking about next steps towards clinical trials. And when we interviewed them in depth about the history of how research subjects are enrolled in clinical trials, did they understand about informed consent, what were the motives of people to be first ever in humans, experimental trials, there was a tremendous lack of interest in that subject. And basically the sense was that clinical trials for first in human or early in human bioengineering involve small groups of people. And the idea was, why worry so much about the procedural ethics or respect for autonomy of a small group of people when we may wipe out a very serious disease? So it's the same thing again, that there was a very real and genuine utilitarian desire to maximize benefit and minimize harm, but there wasn't really an appreciation of what that would mean for individuals who would be partnering in that by being research subjects. And so I want to give you one other thought experiment, because people sometimes say to me, if great suffering is at stake, then we really can't worry so much about informed consent, respect for autonomy, privacy, all of these things. So this is one, a little thought experiment that was developed by a British philosopher, Philippa Foot. So will you all do this with me? Okay? This is to see how much, if there's great suffering at stake, do you still care about autonomy? Okay? So imagine two soldiers on a battlefield, and one of them has been mortally wounded, and is definitely going to die. And you're the buddy of this soldier. You're stuck away from everybody else. No one's ever going to rescue you in time. And your best friend, your buddy, has just been wounded, and he's clearly dying. And it'll probably take days for him to die, 3-4 days, in the most terrible agony imaginable. And you love this guy. You don't want to see him suffer like that. So you all have some little vial of something that you can put in your water to end your life in case you get captured. So you say to your friend, buddy, listen, this is the end. Say your last words or whatever you want to say, but why don't you drink this? Because otherwise you're just going to be tortured for 4 days. And your friend says to you, no, I don't want it. How many of you would put that, think about it, how many of you would put that in his water anyway? Again, not very good utilitarians, any of us. We're not trying to eliminate his suffering by overriding his autonomy. Okay, so what does all this mean? It does not mean that you should throw out utilitarianism, because again, we're all experts. A lot of you are CEOs, and we have a leadership role for society. So long as we have a leadership role for society, you do have to think about aggregate benefit and aggregate harm and maximizing benefit for a future collective. So you have to retain your utilitarian axis. But you must have a more complex view of ethics where you also build back your human deontological axis, where you get why the public is so worried about little things like privacy and trust and their autonomy and not being manipulated. I really appreciated Stefan's comments that he called out manipulation, because in public health, my field, a lot of where we manipulate people is to promote their health. So you care about both those axes and engage both those axes. And while that sounds enormously complicated, what it really does is it shows you that ethics is not, there's not one ethical answer. Ethics is just as complex as science, and that good ethical reasoning involves noticing conflicts of obligation. And that word is not, I use that phrase, nobody seems to know what I mean by that. People, I think, get nervous because we're all taught we shouldn't have conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest, which we actually all probably have and should study more, but conflicts of interest are when your own self-interest interferes with your professional role. But conflicts of obligation are when you have obligations to appropriate ethical obligations going in two different directions. Very simple example in social media is the companies have an obligation to protect vulnerable people from noxious things on social media, but they also have an obligation to protect free speech. That's not that's an appropriate conflict to face. So we need to be aware of our conflicts of obligation, and we have examples in the history of ethics of guidelines that address that. So in my last minute or two, let me just bring up that in the history of research with human subjects, we have guidelines, and they've been put into laws and regulation, and they come from the Belmont Report, which came out in 1979, which has 3 different principles. 2 of them are deontological, respect for autonomy and justice or fairness. The other is utilitarian, maximize benefit and minimize harm. And they can be used together in a very discerning way. So for example, how much informed consent matters in a research study depends on the balance of benefits and harms, or what it means to treat people fairly in a medical intervention has to do with, again, if an intervention has a big chance of harm and only a small chance of benefit, then if you have a disadvantaged population, the way you treat them fairly is you don't do research with them because they're likely to be harmed and they are always getting harmed. But if you have a very big chance of benefit and a very small chance of harm, then the way you treat, let's say, a low-income country fairly in research is you include them because their needs are not otherwise met. So utilitarianism informs deontology. Rights and duties inform maximizing benefit and minimizing harm, and we publicly accept as leaders that we have conflicting ethical systems as ordinary human beings and as social engineers. And that acceptance, I think publicly, and I have evidence of this in my work, will allow the public to trust us a great deal more. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. To sum up our session series, or our series of disruption and trust, I now introduce you to a wonderful woman, Jodi Marietje. Great, thank you for coming. Come, Marietje. Marietje is very sharp. I saw her recently in Stanford at a discussion with Eric Schmidt and you on AI, and I was, Eric Schmidt, this experienced guy, really was how to say it, he was very impressed by you, almost overwhelmed. Thank you for telling him so much. So, what's your take on disruption and trust?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't... Thank you. Good morning, thanks. I didn't need the elevation, otherwise I would be towering very far over you. Thank you, Stefan and Hyunjun and Jodi, for your great reflections on the question of disruption and trust. And I really want to invite you, as we close this session, to think a little bit further about particularly what principles we do not want to disrupt. Because with 30 years of experience between the promise of what technologies and the open internet would bring and the realization of the practice where we are today, I think we have to be a little bit more critical when we talk about these broad concepts. And we have to acknowledge, and I think that that's also reflected in what Jodi said, that good intentions by business leaders, leaders in general, technologists, politicians, don't automatically translate into equally good and positive results. Because new technologies, the open internet, came with the promise of creating a wave of democratization. And it was really backed by a belief of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy so strong that democratic governments broke with a decade-long tradition. A tradition and a position of leadership in shaping an international rules-based order and advancing that order so that trade, but also human rights and war and peace were actually framed in guardrails, were rules to raise the bar of standards and to actually bake principles into agreements so that there would be accountability for those who breached the rules. And while the whole narrative around social media and mobile technology was supposed to be one of allowing democracy to go viral, I think we now see that in many ways the opposite has happened. We find new vulnerabilities in our democracies that are exacerbated by technologies. I mean, the post-mortem on the 2016 presidential elections in the United States that is still ongoing with many unanswered questions, I believe is a case in point, but also challenges to fundamental rights. For example, with facial recognition technology. They are in direct confrontation with each other. So we see plenty of new vulnerabilities, and I agree completely with what Maria said yesterday in her wonderful and very inspiring and also moving talk, that 2020 is going to be a crucial year. And I think that democratic governments, but also their supporters, and I really hope all of you consider yourself to be supporters of democracy, we really have to catch up very fast, starting with making democracy more resilient. And I wish that at tech conferences like DLD and others, we would talk more about how we can all make democracy more resilient. Because the vacuum in democracy-driven, democracy-led rules globally is being filled in. It's filled in through governance by corporations, by companies, through tech standards as such, but also because of profit models that were frankly never designed or designed with consideration of democracy. So as this libertarian, hands-off approach to governance was very much in vogue in Silicon Valley and as a result rippled through the world and was baked into the technologies we all use, we see that a vacuum in democratic governance in the space of the digital ecosystem was very much filled in by authoritarian regimes. And they have, by and large, made technology an instrument of their governance and their political models. And it's been so successful, as we see a tilt of balance in general between non-democratic countries and democratic countries, that almost every effort that is done, for example, at the UN level to come to global agreement on rules in the digital ecosystem, the majority tilts towards the non-democratic countries already. And that trend is only going to be exacerbated, not only because of rising powers and more strategic operations by non-democratic governments, but also because there's such a gold rush by companies to make profits in countries where growing populations and growing markets are very, very attractive, even if that means compromise of democratic human rights and rule of law principles. So what do we need? I think we need to do more and say, don't trust, but verify. Again, good intentions and hope are simply not good enough. And it also means that we have to be more critical of the companies that are not so much in view. I mean, every day we can read stories about what Facebook has done this time, and new incidents and new scandals, but there's also a number of companies, think about data brokers, and yesterday a very powerful investigative report in the New York Times on a company called Clearview that probably most people have not heard of, but that are also developing technologies that have a very, very damaging impact on people's human rights, such as the right to privacy. And so I think it is essential that there's going to be more commitment, not only in word, but also in deed, by democratic governments and companies to the rule of law and democracy. And we talk a lot about ethics. You know, I think it's a bit of a buzzword these days, but we have to go beyond ethics. In Europe alone, the Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe has calculated that there's 180 government-led ethics frames around technology. And I worry that if everything is ethics, nothing is ethics. And we have to make it more tangible and more concrete what we mean by ethics. It is too soft to really create more accountability and a rules-based framework. And if we only keep talking about sort of soft principles, then we will not close the accountability gap, which I think is a very urgent issue to do. We also have to have stronger safeguards against the worst possible impacts, and we have to have a more vivid public discussion about how much risk we are willing to take. What do we think is going to be the consequence if you can order online a DNA test and just go hacking at it at home? What do we think that's going to lead to? I think that's the kinds of questions we need more attention for. And I don't think it's going to come automatically. I spent 10 years in the European Parliament, and I'm convinced more than ever that regulation is needed. Now, Stefan talked about the need for industrial countries to come together and to work together, but I think the only chance we have to have a strong and sustainable answer to the non-democratic tendencies flourishing is when democratic countries work together, when their supporters come together, and we develop a democratic governance model for technology. A model that puts principles first and allows regulators to enforce with the powers that they need, so that we don't have to change and make new laws for every new technology that's developed, but so that we really anchor the principle and then have robust mandates for regulators to inquire whether those laws are respected. Now, if we think that these are urgent questions now, as I do, artificial intelligence puts all of these questions on steroids. Because we see that digitization often means privatization, and that these new technologies, especially AI, put a lot of fundamental questions in core view. What does it mean to be human? Just one of those fundamental questions. Or what does free choice or choice mean? Who has agency? And then if we're not so sure what is driving choice, what does that mean for liberal democracy, where the agency of a person and one person's vote and voice is the key ingredient? We've heard yesterday from Maria and others how truth erosion is a fundamental issue, and how truth erosion then erodes trust. And all of these questions are really exacerbated by AI, where I think the disruption is going to go up and the trust will not automatically follow. And what I think is remarkable, and I've not seen that in any other tech-related topic, is that when it comes to artificial intelligence, most corporate leaders actually support regulation. Maybe it's a sign that carrying the weight of the responsibility that the impact of this technology might bring is too much to carry. But if there's one thing that I hope you remember today, is that in order to actually make sure that laws apply online as they do offline, to make sure that we have explainable, accountable algorithms and artificial intelligence, if we want to verify that non-discrimination principles are also respected by digital processes, then we need access to information in the public interest. I mentioned already that digitization often means privatization, and I think that one of the major challenges for democracy is that we're losing view of what goes on under the hood of all these algorithms and machine-driven processes. It makes it harder to understand what was an intended and an unintended outcome. Makes it hard to verify whether a platform or technology was abused or merely used as designed or intended. Without access to information, we're blindsided, and democracy cannot be resilient. So, arguments I often heard against stronger rules is that regulation should not be adopted too fast, that if we would regulate, it would stifle innovation, or that if we would act, China would follow. But I actually think that we've hardly ever been too fast in adopting regulations. In fact, one of the big criticisms we hear all the time is that we've been too slow. So let's try to be on time for once. And I also believe in this argument that regulation should not stifle innovation. We have to be very, very careful that we do not put innovation at a higher order of significance than democracy. It is perfectly legitimate for democratic governments to adopt regulations, to adjust to the changes that technology bring. And also, this argument of otherwise China will also adopt all kinds of regulations. Frankly, don't we all wish that they would copy our actions many more times, because then we would see a much more free and open China already. I think we should not be selective in preventing our own actions as we would worry that others would follow them, because they already, other governments already do what they see fit, and it shouldn't stop us from taking our own responsibilities. So I'm going to conclude here by saying that governance is very much baked into technologies. And the biggest question is governance on the basis of which values? Do we choose efficiency, optimization, or do we choose democracy, the rule of law, and human rights? So when we think about disruption and trust, I think this question is crucial. And not only to think, okay, we have disruption and how do we mitigate, but really to also push ourselves to ask the question, where do we not want to see further disruption? And high on my list is democracy. And for that to happen, we need rules, we need accountability, we cannot trust, but we have to verify. Thank you.